Good afternoon. My name is Kaylin Weber, and I'm Associate Curator, the Jeannie Kilroy Wilson Curator of American Painting and Sculpture here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. First, I would like to thank you for choosing to spend this beautiful day inside with us. I promise that our speaker today will not disappoint. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to the first of 5 lectures in the 44th annual Ruth K. Sharda Lecture Series. The Ruth K. Sharda Lecture Series was established in 1975 by Alice Pratt Brown, Mrs. George R. Brown, a major museum benefactor, in memory of her friend, Ruth K. Sharda, who was also a longtime museum benefactor. William C. Agee, then director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, described these lectures as a commemoration of Ruth Sharda's unstinting friendship, her intellectual curiosity, and generous spirit of sharing her enthusiasm for man's creative accomplishments, and most of all, her unselfish, fresh spirit and an unfailing joy of life. Each year, the Sharda Lectures celebrate one of the museum's major exhibitions, or key areas of the museum's collections. All of the Sharda Lectures have been fully funded by the Brown Foundation. In the spring of this year, the 43rd annual Ruth K. Sharda Lecture Series celebrated the exhibition Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. What a better subject for the 2019-2020 Ruth Sharda Lecture Series than the groundbreaking exhibition Here Now, Norman Rockwell, American Freedom, which opened today. Norman Rockwell, American Freedom is the first comprehensive exhibition devoted to Rockwell's iconic depictions of the 4 freedoms outlined by President Franklin Roosevelt. The presentation explores how Rockwell's 1943 paintings came to be embraced by millions of Americans. Organized by the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, the exhibition is traveling to 7 domestic and international venues, and we happen to have the privilege of being the 5th venue. We are thrilled to present the work of Norman Rockwell to our Houston audiences because even though many of these iconic images are very familiar, many of our viewers have not ever actually seen the actual paintings, only the reproductions. This exhibition also represents the first major presentation of the art of Norman Rockwell in the 100-year history of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. This exhibition would not have been possible without our generous funders, so we'd like to thank them now. Our lead exhibition funder, the Hamill Foundation, along with M.D. Anderson Foundation, Melza and Ted Barr, Memorial Herman, John Now III, Susie and Mel Glasscock, Carla Knobloch, the Radoff family, Ann Trammell, Kelly and Harper Trammell, and Flo McGee. Today, our first Sharda lecture will be presented by Stephanie Plunkett. Stephanie is Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge. She is the organizing curator of this exhibition. She has curated many exhibitions relating to the art of illustration, notably Inventing America, Rockwell and Warhol, Rockwell and Realism in an Abstract World, and The Art of the New Yorker, 80 Years of the Vanguard. Before coming to the Norman Rockwell Museum, Stephanie held positions at the Brooklyn Museum and the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Stephanie's lecture today, titled Art for a Civil Society, Norman Rockwell in the 1960s, will offer an in-depth exploration of Rockwell's art for civil rights across the decades. As curator of the show, Stephanie brings a wealth of expertise in the art of Rockwell, so we're in for a real treat. The other treat I'd like to announce is that after the lecture, please join us for a reception and book signing upstairs in the lobby of the Law Building. So please join me now in giving Stephanie a warm Texas welcome.
That was a beautiful, warm Texas welcome. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today, and I have truly enjoyed my time in Texas. This has been my first visit, and it's been truly wonderful. Thanks to all of you. I'd like to begin by offering sincere thanks on behalf of all of us at the Norman Rockwell Museum to Director Gary Tinterow, to Associate Curator for American Painting and Sculpture Kaylin Weber, to Assistant Director of Exhibitions Deborah Roldan, to Margaret Mims, who invited me to speak and has put together a wonderful series of programs here, and to Amanda Lett, our wonderful curatorial assistant, who also helped with the exhibition. The entire staff here is just extraordinary, but I'm thinking you probably know that already. Their installation of Norman Rockwell, American Freedom, is just beautiful. As was just mentioned, the exhibition began its 2-year tour in New York City, has made stops in Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Normandy, France, where it commemorated the historic 75th anniversary of D-Day. We are honored that the paintings that Rockwell considered to be his finest accomplishments, along with many other works that are now on view here from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, including some amazing photographs, which build out the exhibition themes beautifully. Thank you again to our wonderful colleagues for your incredible support. And I'd just like to mention, Norman Rockwell Museum has some very special people on our board and National Council who live in the Houston area, and our friends Marty and Jim Bush are on the museum's National Council and live in Waco, Texas, not too far away. So they are here today, and thank you so much for coming. Norman Rockwell, American Freedoms, explores the indelible odyssey of humanity's greatest ideals. The notion of the four freedoms has inspired dozens of national constitutions across the globe, yet Franklin D. Roosevelt's declaration that the United States was willing to fight for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, now considered a sublime moment in rhetorical history, did not turn out to be the immediate triumph that he envisioned. As the nation found itself sliding ever closer to direct involvement in World War II, the underlying meaning of the words captured surprisingly little attention among Americans. Following his January 6, 1941 annual message to Congress, government surveys showed that only half of Americans were aware of FDR's four freedoms, and that less than a quarter could actually identify them correctly. Moreover, many had no clear idea why the United States was being called upon to enter the war. It would take the continuous efforts of the White House, the Office of War Information, and scores of patriotic artists to give the four freedoms new life. Most prominent among those was Norman Rockwell, whose interpretations became a national sensation in early 1943 when they first were published in the Saturday Evening Post. Underscoring the power of images, Rockwell's words and Roosevelt's words and Rockwell's artworks were soon inseparable in the public consciousness. As evidenced in his four freedoms, Norman Rockwell wanted to make a difference with his art, and as a trusted and marketable illustrator, he had the opportunity to do so. In the 1960s, leaving behind his beloved storytelling scenes, the artist reflected upon America's most pressing social concerns. After ending his 47-year career with the Post, he took on new challenges at Look magazine. And in this talk, we'll examine Rockwell's art for a civil society, which faced hard realities during the civil rights movement, but invited us to envision a more compassionate world. Before we jump to that important aspect of his work, I thought it might make sense to share some background on Rockwell himself and on his unrivaled career as the 20th century's most prominent illustrator. For many, Norman Rockwell's icons of living culture were first experienced in the most unassuming of places, in the comfort of home or on the train ride at the end of a long day. Created for the covers and pages of our nation's periodicals rather than for the walls of galleries and museums, Rockwell's images were intimately understood by a vast and eager audience who saw the best in themselves reflected in his art and in the stories that he chose to tell. His intricate narratives imbued ordinary activities with a sense of historical importance, seizing the moment almost as it was about to fade. It's hard to see it on the screen, but if you look at the lower right of this picture, there is an inscription. And the inscription says, "To Walt Disney, one of the greatest artists, from an admirer, Norman Rockwell." The two were actually friends and knew each other from Rockwell's travels to California. And right after this was published, Rockwell sent it to Walt Disney. And it hung on his walls for many years. And very fortunately, after it came to the possession of Disney's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, she donated it to the Norman Rockwell Museum, and we are fortunate to have it in our collection now. Rockwell's published imagery was ephemeral, replaced at the turn of a page by a succession of magazine issues and illustrations, but his original paintings were made to last. Bearing the mark of history, his large-scale canvases offered so much more than was necessary, even by the standards of his profession. By virtue of his training and his inclination, he called the history of European art into play, employing classical painting methodology to weave contemporary tales inspired by everyday people and places. A cast of affable, exquisitely painted characters and a plethora of supporting details kept him and his audience engaged and inspired belief by millions in the uniquely American vision that he conceived and continued to refine. In 1943, a Time magazine reporter noted that Rockwell, quote, constantly achieves the compromise between a love of realism and the tendency to idealize, which is one of the most deeply ingrained characteristics of the American people. In today's digital age, it is difficult to imagine the role that magazines played in a society quite unlike our own, when periodicals served as the primary source of information and entertainment. The ongoing focus of visual artists, filmmakers, and photographers, storytelling in pictures predates verbal language. For centuries, narrative picture makers were employed to display the wealth and power of their patrons, like the Prophet Isaiah on the left by Michelangelo for the Sistine ceiling. And artists first gained access to mass audiences during the 19th century when the publishing industry replaced both church and state as the leading employer of artists and the most prominent showcase for their work. This is a very famous World War II era picture called, everybody know who this is? Rosie the Riveter. Rockwell, of course, was a student of art history, and you can see here that Michelangelo's Prophet Isaiah served as a great model for this amazing woman who has gone into the workforce to work in a factory. And if you notice, her foot is planted firmly on Hitler's Mein Kampf. At the end of the 19th century and during the early decades of the 20th, books and periodicals were a lifeline to the larger world. When Rockwell's first cover for the Saturday Evening Post appeared in 1916, the Post, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Women's Home Companion, and other leading magazines had vast, loyal followings and were richly illustrated, enticing readers to purchase magazines and the products featured within them. While top publications boasted subscriptions of 2 to 8 million during the 1940s and 50s, anxiously awaited magazines were shared among family and friends, bringing the readership even higher. Illustrators working at the time were far more than picture makers. They had a crucial role in affecting the cultural appetites of the day. Their influence in shaping the American character as we know it is inextricably linked to the development of an industry whose main purpose was to embrace the aspirations of a nation and create an American dream. During his 6-decade career, Rockwell was witness to important modernist and postmodern art movements, from Impressionism and Cubism to Surrealism, abstract expressionism, and pop art. In choosing a path of illustration, he earned the reputation as one of Americans' preeminent visual commentators, helping to forge a sense of national identity through his art. He famously once commented that while he enjoyed receiving admiring letters from the public, and he received them by the bagful, he said, "I'd love it if the critics would notice me too." But by the 1950s, abstract art had successfully attracted collectors and critics whose passion for visceral, less readable artworks was in itself noteworthy. I'll just mention here, this is Rockwell's iconic triple self-portrait. And if you notice, he places himself within a kind of a pantheon of important historical artists on the right. He did claim that Rembrandt was his favorite artist, but he certainly appreciated modern painting and had a tremendous collection of art books, often visited museums. At times, struggling with his artistic identity and observing the cultural forces that relegated narrative painting, and especially the art of illustration, to a lesser status, Rockwell commented, "My ability evidently lies in telling stories, and modern art doesn't go in much for that sort of thing." Rockwell's 1961 painting, The Connoisseur, confronts the heated debate over high and low art and the dominance of abstract art. While The Connoisseur juxtaposes the conservative with the modern, it offers no clue in Rockwell's mind as to what this viewer's opinion actually is. "You don't know what he's thinking," Rockwell said of the viewer, whose face he did not show. Segregated from modern art by the deep roots of his academic training, Rockwell could embrace it only as an observer. The borrowing of Jackson Pollock's style acknowledges a world that he would never enter. We see Rockwell here in his studio, in his stocking feet, making a mess, which he absolutely almost never did. He was an extremely neat painter. But here he is actually trying to figure out how to make drip paintings with tiny cans of paint this big, nothing like what Jackson Pollock would have used, so it's kind of fun. Pollock himself, a skilled draftsman, noted that the modern artist is working with space and time and expressing his feelings rather than illustrating. After completing the work I just showed you, Rockwell submitted this section of one of his studies to an exhibition at the Cooperstown Art Association in New York, signing the canvas with an Italian signature. It took first prize for painting. Another section of the abstract study, signed under his middle name Percival, won honorable mention at an exhibition at the Berkshire Museum in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Norman Rockwell was born in New York City on February 3rd, 1894. The earliest evidence of his interest in art appears in his remembrance of his father copying illustrations from magazines in the evening after dinner, and you see one of those copied drawings on the right-hand side. Rockwell said that he joined him sketching dogs, houses, and vegetables, and from my imagination, pirates, whales, and Indians. Even more permanently etched in Rockwell's memory were images evoked by English writer Charles Dickens. Read aloud in the evenings after dinner, Dickens' stories inspired Rockwell, and he drew the characters even as he listened. Rockwell read Dickens throughout his life and adopted the author's literary view, observing the world around him and everyday life for its rich narratives and powerful characterizations. City life for Rockwell was upstaged by summer vacations the family enjoyed at upstate New York boarding house farms. Rockwell is actually seen on your right holding a frog. We don't know who the other boy is, but that is Rockwell. The annual summer idyls ingrained a store of memories and emotions in Rockwell from which he would later draw upon for his work. They also influenced his permanent move to the country in 1939. As Dickens' stories had confirmed, the city felt overcrowded, polluted, and intrinsically less humanitarian. Rockwell began the full-time study of art after his sophomore year of high school at the National Academy School in New York City, but after tedious and dull drawing from plaster casts 8 hours a day for several months, he transferred to the Art Students League, where relationships between students and teachers were more direct and vital. Rockwell is actually seen looking very dapper right next to the model. He is standing. And this photograph, we believe, was taken a little bit later after his studies when he came back to visit the school, but had already begun his professional career. Tackling his assignments with a dedication that earned him the nickname the Deacon, Rockwell became one of the school's most promising students. With artist Thomas Fogarty's recommendation, Rockwell gained entry to the New York publisher McBride, Nast & Company, which hired him to do 8 illustrations for an edition of C.H. Cloudy's Tell Me Why stories, and many assignments for children's magazines followed. It was not long before the editor of the Boy Scouts monthly magazine, Boy's Life, asked Rockwell to illustrate a Boy Scout handbook. As a youth of just 19, Rockwell was retained as art director of Boy's Life, which was expanding to national circulation. Even in these early works, Rockwell's insistence on making each character a unique individual is clear. He would go on to create images for the Boy Scouts of America for 50 years. Did anybody here get Boy's Life magazine? Any Boy Scouts in the audience? You remember them then? In 1916, when Rockwell was 22, he submitted this work to the premier showcase for America's top illustrators, the Saturday Evening Post. He considered the Post to be, in his words, the greatest show window in America for an illustrator, and bolstering his courage, he took the train to Philadelphia, carrying a newly crafted wooden box that someone told him looked like a coffin, and it contained Boy with Baby Carriage, one other finished painting, and a sketch to submit as a cover idea. The Post accepted the 2 paintings for $75 and told him to go ahead with his sketch. Billy Payne, who posed for all 3 characters in the painting you just saw, was one of his favorite early models. 45 minutes from Broadway, New Rochelle, New York, was New York's most affluent city in the 1920s and had more artists per capita than almost any place in the country. Rockwell lived in New Rochelle from 1912 to 1939, and it was also home to such illustration titans as Edward Penfield, art director of Harper's Magazine, J.C. Leyendecker, the Post top cover artist and illustrator of the New Year's Baby and Arrow collar ads, and you'll see some World War II New Year's Babies in the exhibition. Coles Phillips, who was famous for his Fadeaway Girl, and Mead Schaefer, who was an illustrator of fictional classics, as well as covers for the Saturday Evening Post. There are 4 very striking paintings of Schaefer's Saturday Evening Post images of the branches of the armed forces on view in the exhibition. Many of the artists met socially. They shared models, they critiqued each other's work, and even judged beauty contests. Yes, in fact, Rockwell was a judge at the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey, in 1922, 23, and 25, and he sometimes shared the dais with illustrators Coles Phillips, Howard Chandler Christie, and Dean Cornwell. And Rockwell is there on the left. I think he looks a little nervous, but I don't know. You tell me what you think. In the 1920s, as Rockwell's popularity soared, he typically spent 12 to 14 hours a day in his studio. Curtis Publishing became the primary purveyor of Rockwell illustrations in its 3 magazines: The Post, Ladies' Home Journal, and Country Gentleman. In the 1930s, a major influence on Rockwell's art came not from an artistic movement or style, but from using photography. The wear and tear and strain that working with living models placed on me was awful, he said. I would sit for 8 hours yelling, "Lift eyebrows, raise that arm a little, make that smile a little bigger." I would carry out all of these gestures and facial expressions myself, and by the end of the day, I was so tired and nervous that I was ready to drop. Rockwell said he never got over the feeling that using photography to capture models' poses was cheating, and years passed before he publicly admitted to using photographs for his 1936 illustrations for The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And actually, the photograph on the right is one of the earliest that we have in the museum's archives. It is by the photographer Richard Riley Birch, and Birch did do some photography for Rockwell when he was living in New Rochelle, New York. In 1939, a move to Arlington, Vermont brought a whole new retinue of models, and after a 1943 fire destroyed his studio, complete with costume reference and prop collections, he reevaluated his choice of subjects as well. Rockwell had always wanted to be topical and record the current scene, and now his artistic path was fixed. Rockwell was a wonderful cartoonist, as you can see. This is actually an image that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post called "My Studio Burns." And in fact, you can see that on the upper left-hand corner, his son Tom has spotted the fire out the window. On the right-hand side, he tries to call the fire department. And of course, it takes so long for the firemen to get to him in Arlington, Vermont, that at the end of the day, the building and most of its contents was lost. And they managed to save a few bicycles, but in true Rockwell fashion, on the lower left-hand corner, they all sat around and had sandwiches. Luckily, his Four Freedoms paintings had just recently been delivered to Curtis Publishing in Philadelphia. So that was very fortunate. In Vermont, Rockwell was surrounded by fellow Saturday Evening Post illustrators Mead Schaefer, John Atherton, and George Hughes. A balanced blend of peaceful surroundings, family, close friends, good neighbors, and the stimulation of artists fostered an artistic period in which Rockwell created paintings that were instantly regarded as his finest work. During World War II, distant from the activities of war raging in Europe, Rockwell was challenged to record its effects on the servicemen and Americans at home. For Rockwell, an unassuming fictional private whose name was Willie Gillis told the story of one man's army in a series of 14 post covers on which he was depicted doing everything from peeling potatoes to reading his hometown newspaper. These are actually 2 beautiful Willie Gillis paintings that are in the exhibition. The one on the left is unpublished, the one on the right published. So when you go to see it, maybe you can think about why you think that one on the left might not have made it to the cover of the Post. Rockwell's only image of a soldier in battle designed to stimulate ammunition production at munitions factories featured a powerful machine gunner for the poster, "Let's Give Him Enough and On Time." But Rockwell wanted to do more for the war effort and decided to illustrate Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms ideals. presented during the President's January 1941 address to Congress. Finding new ideas for paintings never came easily, but this was a greater challenge. While considering his approach by chance, he attended a town hall meeting where a Vermont neighbor stood and rose among his neighbors respectfully to voice an unpopular view. That night, the artist awoke with the realization that he could best paint the four freedoms from the perspective of his own experiences, using everyday scenes to illuminate more abstract ideas. In fact, of his four freedoms, this was the only one that was inspired by an actual event. The others were based upon his observations of everyday life, but this was quite particular. Rockwell made some sketches and went to Washington to propose his ideas. The timing was wrong. The Ordnance Department did not have the resources for another commission, and disappointed, Rockwell stopped at Curtis Publishing Company in Philadelphia on his way home, and he presented his concept to Post editor Ben Hibbs. Hibbs immediately made plans to publish the illustrations, giving Rockwell permission to interrupt his cover work for a period of 3 months. He had what he called a case of stage fright, but despite his early misgivings, the paintings were a phenomenal success and received words of praise even from Rockwell's friend Walt Disney. After their publication, the magazine received thousands of requests for reprints. And in April 1943, the Post and the U.S. Department of Treasury announced a joint campaign to sell war bonds and stamps, capitalizing on Rockwell's vision. Roosevelt's words and Rockwell's artwork soon became inseparable in the public consciousness, with millions of reproductions bringing the four freedoms directly into American homes and workplaces. The paintings of his Vermont years, more than any others, comprise the indelible images that forged Rockwell's identity as an American artist: the Four Freedoms, Rosie the Riveter, Shuffleton's Barbershop, inspired by his own barbershop in Arlington, Vermont, and St. Grace, the only painting that Rockwell ever admitted to using someone else's idea for. A letter came from a woman in Pennsylvania who stated that she had observed people sitting together in a crowded diner, and she thought it would make a great post-cover idea. So Rockwell jumped off of that here. These created Rockwell's brand. Though his Post readers had always enjoyed the antics and exploits of his child models, they now were asked to look at Rockwell's work in a new way. Childhood in America and Rockwell's reflection of it were changing. The population swell of the baby boom, the new role and image of women forged by recently acquired opportunities, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons forced us to see ourselves and our worlds in a different light. As a perennial idealist, Rockwell didn't include the worries of the new generation in his work, but he did look more seriously at the subject of youth, depicting adolescents as more complex, dimensional people. Children were seen less at play and more at learning how to grow up, ultimately to face the problems of a modern world and deal with issues that were previously, in Rockwell's words, swept under the rug. In 1953, Norman Rockwell and his wife Mary relocated to Arlington, Vermont, from Arlington, Vermont to Massachusetts, where Mary was being treated for depression at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge. The small town of 2,100 people provided new faces and new inspirations for such pictures as his 1959 family tree, which traced the lineage of the all-American boy from a 16th century pirate and a Spanish princess captured on the Caribbean Sea. What's funny about that, or interesting anyway, is that Rockwell's own therapist, Eric Erickson, who helped him with things like painter's block, said, "Why would you want to start an all-American family with a scoundrel?" And Rockwell said, "Well, everyone has a black sheep or two in their family." So he stuck with his original idea. Much in Rockwell's art is inspired by autobiography. In 1952, all three Rockwell sons were away from home. Continuing an artistic tradition of communicating the rite of passage that is a child leaving home, Rockwell created Breaking Home Ties. Painted as a back-to-school cover in September 1954 for the Post, it was among his most important works and one of his most popular, placing second after Saying Grace in a reader opinion poll. "I once did a cover showing a father seeing his son off to college," Rockwell wrote. "That year, my 3 boys had gone, and I'd had an empty feeling. It took me a while to adjust without them. This poignancy was what I wanted to get across in the picture. But there was humor in it as well," Rockwell wrote. "I put a funny kind of suit on the boy because he was a ranch boy leaving home for the first time. And his father was holding 2 hats, one the boy's beat-up old rancher's hat and the other his brand new hat. The boy was carrying a lunchbox all done up in a pink ribbon. I drew a collie dog with his head on the boy's lap. I got most of my fan letters about the dog. You see, the father couldn't show how he felt about the boys leaving, but the dog did." Another work, his 1955 Art Critic, was inspired by Rockwell's experiences as an art student and those of his son Jarvis, who was then enrolled at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Rockwell labored over Art Critic to the exclusion of other work, producing more than a dozen preliminaries for the portrait within the painting and 3 versions of the Dutch scene in the painting's background. I'll take you very quickly through this crazy process. On the left-hand side, you see a small thumbnail sketch and even a photo session in which Rockwell originally thought that his artist would be a little older and a little more bohemian. He then went into large charcoal drawings, and if you notice, there are some very distinct changes both to the portrait as well as to the larger painting in the background, which originated as a kind of a bucolic 17th century Dutch landscape, but of course there was no punch in that, and Rockwell, looking for some wonderful activity, changed the concept to the Dutch masters on the right-hand side. His ultimate portrait in the picture was inspired by Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens. And here Rockwell poses his wife Mary, who was always a ready model and a wonderful model for the artist. Finally, you can see Rockwell here in his studio with the many studies that he created to create a painting that would remain on the cover of a magazine for 1 week and then be thrown away. So it's remarkable what he was willing to go through to create his art. In the 1960s, leaving behind his beloved storytelling scenes, Rockwell threw himself into a new genre, the documentation of social issues. Golden Rule, seen here, is a 1961 post cover that is on view in the exhibition. It features a gathering of men, women, and children of different races, religions, and ethnicities. The inscription, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," was simple but universal and reflected Rockwell's personal philosophy. As he aptly noted, many countries, cultures, and religions incorporate some version of the Golden Rule into their belief system. Rockwell considered himself a citizen of the world, and he traveled throughout his life. He said, "I had tried to depict all the people of the world gathering together. This is just what I wanted to express about the Golden Rule." This icon-like work features several mothers and their children, and among them is Rockwell's wife, Mary, who passed away in 1959 before this work was completed. And you can actually see Mary up in the right corner, right here. She is seen here holding her first grandson, Jeffrey, whom she never had the opportunity to meet. So this was a kind of an homage that Rockwell did shortly after his wife passed away. In 1963, due to editorial changes at the Post, which was moving away from narrative illustration in its attempt to present itself as a modern publication, Rockwell made the decision to leave the magazine that had become synonymous with his art. Humor and pathos, traits that made his Post covers successful, were replaced by a direct, pared-down repertorial style more appropriate for the magazine's editorials that he would produce at Look. I'll just say a couple of words about this. This was actually Norman Rockwell's very last cover for the Saturday Evening Post. He had first painted John F. Kennedy in 1960 when Kennedy was a candidate for president. And following Kennedy's assassination, the Post decided to reprint the cover with a black border in memoriam to the president. One of the issues for Rockwell was that he was being asked to do more and more portraiture, and he was very adept at it, but it was not the type of work that he loved to do. He really considered himself to be a visual storyteller. In works that continue to resonate, Rockwell reported on important social issues and on the space race, depicting the 1969 moon landing before and after it actually happened. I wanted to mention he even visited the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center here in Houston to research and take photos for his illustration of the now historic July 20th, 1969 Apollo 11 moon landing. The painting of Commander Neil Armstrong standing on the moon's surface and pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin descending from the lunar module Eagle was, he said, the most complicated and difficult of his space pictures. It's also the only painting series that we know of where he consulted another artist and even asked for help. He asked for help from the illustrator Pierre Millon, who did a lot of work for National Geographic, and he needed help with the moon's surface. That's what he was struggling with. The artist's 1964 painting, The Problem We All Live With, an assertion on moral decency, was inspired by Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old African-American schoolgirl escorted by 4 U.S. Marshals to her first day at an all-white school in New Orleans. Ordered to proceed with school desegregation after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, Louisiana lagged behind until pressure from federal Judge Skelly Wright forced the school board to begin the integration process on November 14, 1960. Letters to the editor were a mix of praise and criticism. One Florida reader wrote, "Rockwell's picture is worth 1,000 words. I am saving this issue for my children with the hope that by the time they become old enough to comprehend its meaning, the subject matter will have become history." Other readers objected to Rockwell's image. Just where does Norman Rockwell live? Just where does your editor live? Probably both of these men live in all-white, highly expensive, highly exclusive neighborhoods. Oh, what hypocrites all of you are. Another called Rockwell's work, quote, "just some vicious, lying propaganda being used for the crime of racial integration." But irate opinions did not stop Rockwell from pursuing his course. In 1965, he illustrated the murder of civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and in 1967, he chose children once again to illustrate desegregation in our suburbs. On June 21st, 1964, civil rights activists Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were brutally murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Look commissioned Rockwell to create this illustration for an investigative article about the crime. The work was unusual for Rockwell. It is stark, monochromatic, and sparsely painted. Rockwell focuses on the plight of the activists. The Klansmen are visible only as ominous shadows encroaching upon their victims from the right. Rockwell was told to proceed with his Murder in Mississippi painting based upon the presentation of this sketch. After receiving the final painting, however, Look art director Alan Hurlburt chose to publish the study instead. And what you're actually seeing here is the study that was published on the left. An additional study on the upper right, which actually shows the deputy and his posse. Rockwell ultimately decided that it would be more powerful, as I said, just showing the shadows moving in from the right. And on the bottom, you're actually seeing the way that it looked in publication and the way that that study appeared with the text, which was a very detailed journalistic article. On March 1st, 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order establishing the Peace Corps, quote, to promote world peace and friendship among nations. Rockwell expressed his admiration for the program by saying, "In this sordid world of power struggles, politics, and national rivalries, the Peace Corps seems to stand alone." This 1966 cover illustration commemorates the Peace Corps' 5th anniversary and features Sergeant Shriver and former Peace Corps volunteers as his models. In New Kids in the Neighborhood, his 1967 illustration of suburban integration in Chicago's Forest Park community for Look, Rockwell was secure in expressing his philosophy of tolerance. The children have much in common and may soon be playing together, but the face peering from behind a curtain leads us to wonder how well the adults will fare. And it's hard to see here, but if you look right there, there's a small face peering out from behind the curtain. 1 year later, Rockwell began work on the right to know, a political statement expressing the right of citizens to be informed of the rationale behind their government's actions. Just months before the painting was to be published, the New York Times reported on the Pentagon Papers, which revealed scandals involving the White House's suppression of information regarding troop escalation and the scope of the war in Vietnam. The artist himself is seen on the right side of this work among his fellow citizens who are seeking answers. And Rockwell, an older artist at that time, is actually seen right here with his signature pipe. For 6 decades, Rockwell inspired Americans by helping them to see the best in themselves. When he shifted his attention to significant social concerns, he faced an audience ready to receive his messages. In 1977, President Gerald Ford honored Rockwell with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest peacetime award, for having portrayed the American scene with unrivaled freshness and clarity, and with insight, optimism, and good humor. Despite declining health and vision, Rockwell accepted a commission to paint the July 1976 cover of American Artist magazine, celebrating America's bicentennial. With the onset of dementia and the effects of emphysema resulting from years of pipe smoking, Rockwell could no longer do the work that had so completely and passionately driven his life. In 1978, the artist died at home at the age of 84. Even though there is a consensus that narrative illustration faltered because the advent of photography reduced the need for naturalistic pictures, this important American art form has always been about more than just the appearance of things. Through the decades, the art of illustration has looked deeply into society as Rockwell has, reflecting and shaping a rapidly changing world. Though stylistic and conceptual trends in the world of fine art and subsequently in the art of illustration have moved in and out of favor, Rockwell remained true to his idiom. His belief in the ability of images to speak about and to humanity was at the artist's core, and his accomplishments represent an unprecedented moment in the evolutionary process of a vibrant and ever-changing art form. Thank you so much.